Welcome to a quick little podcast on the Kingdom Protista. So the Protista podcast is going to cover some general characteristics, how these things are able to feed, and how they're able to reproduce. Make sure you record some of that information in your general notebook. So to begin with, we are now advancing beyond the prokaryotic organisms. So the eubacteria, the archaebacteria were organisms that did not have a nucleus. Now we start to see single-celled organisms that have evolved to have this true nucleus within their cell. So a eukaryote is an organism that actually has a nucleus. So many of you probably have learned about cell structures and their functions back in middle school. So this is a typical animal cell, which is a eukaryote, and it carries all of its genetic information housed within this nuclear membrane called a nucleus. So they belong in the domain Eukarya, and all protists are eukaryotic organisms because they have a true nucleus. Protists are also classified in their own kingdom because they are unicellular. They're made up of one cell, but they have the ability to act like plants in some cases. Some of them act like animals, and some of them are very fungus-like. So there's a group of scientists that argue that the protists should actually be split into 3 separate kingdoms. Well, as of now, we still classify all protists together in one kingdom. But there's some major differences between the plant-like protists and the animal-like protists and fungus-like protists. So what makes some of these different? Well, part of it is how they're able to feed and get their nutrition. So the plant-like protist, like this Euglena, has the ability to photosynthesize. You can see that it's green in color. It has chloroplasts, which allow it to photosynthesize, which is pretty unique. It also has a flagellum, which allows it to move around. So these things can actually sense light using an eye spot. They can move around, search for light, so they can make their own food by photosynthesis. On the contrary, this animal-like protist has the ability to move around with these tiny little hairs that surround its cell membrane called cilia. So it moves around and it can actually feed and bring in food through his oral groove and then digest it, break it down, and get energy from it that way. So this group of protists are autotrophic. This type of protist, called a paramecium, is heterotrophic. Here's another common protist called an amoeba. This thing has special pseudopodia for movement, and it can use those pseudopods for capturing food, bringing that food into its cell, and then ultimately using that for energy. So very diverse, very unique in their ability to obtain energy, and they can do it either autotrophically or heterotrophically. Now, they're very cool because they can also reproduce in a lot of different ways. Some of them have the ability to simply divide by mitosis and reproduce asexually. So we talked about binary fission in bacteria. Some protists are able to do asexual reproduction by binary fission. Some can basically just break off fragments like algae, and those fragments will actually become new cells. Some of them will produce small little buds that will be released, and those will grow and develop into that individual species. In some cases, they have the ability to reproduce sexually. So they can use a process called meiosis, where they can actually make reproductive cells, exchange those reproductive cells by having sex, and share their genetic information, which allows for even more diversity in the protist kingdom. And in some cases, some paramecium can go through a process called conjugation. So there's not a male and a female paramecium, but they have the ability to basically join together, exchange some genetic information, and reproduce and make new offspring. So again, these 3 modes of reproduction can be found in the different types of protists.
Emerald Robinson, and in this What Is video, we're going to discuss a group of organisms called protists. Protists are organisms that have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. Most are one-celled, and they are classified as plant, animal, or fungus-like, meaning they have things in common with these organisms, but they're not quite the same thing. This is because they're relatively simple and don't have tissues and organs. If you think this definition sounds a little confusing, that's with good reason. Biologists use the protist group as sort of a garbage can. If a form of life doesn't meet the criteria for being a plant, animal, or fungus, and it has a nucleus, it's classified as a protist. Still, there's a few characteristics that most protists share. Because protists have a defined nucleus, they belong to the domain Eukarya and are called eukaryotes. Protists were probably the first eukaryotes according to what's called endosymbiotic theory. The first protists formed when cells that did not have a nucleus engulfed smaller cells. Over many years, these smaller cells evolved into the larger cell's nucleus and other organelles. Most protists live in water or very wet environments, and most are able to move. Some swim via whip-like projections called flagella. Some glide using hair-like extensions called cilia, and some pull themselves along using pseudopods, false feet made of cytoplasm. Some protists are free-living, and some are parasites. Some make their own food, and some get nutrition by hunting food or by simply absorbing it from their environment. Protists can reproduce via sperm and egg or by binary fission, splitting into two genetically identical cells. Protists may be simple forms of life, but they're certainly one of the most diverse.
Thank you for that review of the Protist kingdom. So tomorrow, plan on coming to class and being able to observe some of these protists in class. We'll have some live amoeba, some live paramecium, live euglena, and I'll have some prepared slides of Spirogyra and Volvox. And there's a lot of other protists, but just to kind of give you an overview of some of the specialization that we're going to see, we should be able to recognize pseudopods, nucleus, cell membranes in the amoeba. We should be able to see cell membranes, nucleus, oral groove, and cilia in the paramecium. So I really want you to focus on, when you start viewing these in class, some of the specialties that they have that make them very unique and special. Again, Mr. Mechnick, signing off.